Hey there everyone. Hello. And welcome back to another ASMR video. I was struggling to get to sleep because in the UK right now it is 34 degrees and my room feels it. So I thought, because it's coming to the end of my first year at university, I should make a historical facts video on my favourite things I've learnt this year, because I think all the Reddit facts are overused. I say that as if my last two videos weren't primarily constituted out of Reddit facts that I thought were niche, and they were not niche, but we move. So I'm going to be talking about kind of weird things, disjointed bits of history, and I don't intend to perpetuate the idea that everyone's going to find it interesting. I think it's interesting, and at the minute you can just listen and maybe you'll find it interesting too. So, the current thing that I'm researching, this is for my last project of the year, is of the HIV/AIDS crisis. HIV first appeared in 1981. It wasn't called HIV then. They identified this group in both New York and I believe it was LA, who presented with a very rare form of cancer. They were young gay men who had no other known risk factors, and so HIV began with the acronym GRID. Which was meaning gay-related immunodeficiency, along that lines. So HIV wasn't called that first. It was only after HIV began to appear in drug users and haemophiliacs and other groups that it got called something else, which is interesting. And as I probably can't divulge exactly what my question is because I think the uni would go insane. But I think one of the more interesting things that you can apply to things like that is a concept called biopower, which is by this guy who the historians think is a saint, Michel Foucault. He was this French philosopher, historian, sociologist. You can kind of call Foucault whatever you want to call him. And you'd think this guy was a saint. I think this guy called David Halperin, he actually wrote a book called Saint Foucault. That's how big this guy is. Icon. And so the concept of biopower, it works on this other concept that Foucault called subjectification. So, if we take the French Revolution as an example, or things like that, maybe even Henry VIII. Henry VIII doesn't like his wives, he doesn't like people, so what does he do? He guillotines them. So, rule and power was articulated directly through like shows of violence. So you kind of forced into submission if you didn't like the ruler. Tough luck. You rebel against the ruler, you get your head chopped off. It's pretty simple. But Foucault says that with the decline of this direct power, it's become more implicit in our society. So power is still there, but it works instead of through the guillotine, it works in the background through subjectification, which is where you, an individual, a thinking individual, become the subject of the state. You are instilled with social norms and ideas of ideal behaviour, like in AIDS crisis, like heterosexuality, abstinence, not having sex before marriage, stuff like that. And those norms make you a subject, and you're kind of like controlled. Not outright, you still have free will, but your actions are kind of controlled subtly by the state instead. Anyways, that's subjectification, explained in very simple terms. So biopower is the argument that the ultimate expression of power is to decide who lives and who dies. So it's where the state's power has become invested into living bodies. So, for instance, we say that people who are innocent should live and some criminals should die. Or, in the context of HIV and AIDS, we say, oh, the straight people are all moral, they are abiding by the social norms, they should survive. And the gay people and people who aren't white should die. That's biopower. It groups people into like distinct biological groups. Obviously homosexuality isn't like debatable whether it's biological, but you get the gist. And so each group is like separated biologically, and power differentiates them in a hierarchy, which is interesting. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So those are random things that I've learned from. I'm only like a week into reading for this coursework. I have another 2 weeks to do it. But we'll move on. Another thing that I think a lot of people will find interesting is wars. So before Napoleon, so before 1800, wars were traditionally conducted by the aristocracy. So between the wars of religion, which were in the, I believe, 16th to 17th centuries, things like that, they didn't have any rules about like just war or like prisoner of war rights, because states would hire foreign mercenaries. They'd hire from places like Switzerland or Germany. England hired lots and lots of troops, I believe from Saxony, to fight in the American Revolution. So it wasn't exactly British. It might not have been Saxony, it was definitely from Germany. So yeah, the mercenaries were hired from foreign countries, so the state felt it didn't need to protect them because they were already not state citizens, and so there was no rights or anything. And it was only with the French Revolution that this began to change, because when the war was fought by the aristocracy, in the French Revolution, this big guy, one of the biggest names I believe, Emmanuel Sieyès, and he was a revolutionary leader, and he published this pamphlet titled "What is the Third Estate?" So France before the French Revolution was structured into 3 classes: or three orders. You had three estates even. The first estate, second estate, third estate. First estate, I believe, was the first and the second estates were the clergy and the nobility, and they basically made all the decisions. Clergy and nobility, they have all the power. Imagine our billionaires. That's the first and second estate. Third estate was made up of like the peasantry and the workers, and the revolutionaries believed that the third estate should be the one that had all this power. Had the power because they represented the masses. They represented the normal people. So, in What is the Third Estate, Sieyès said that we should renounce all privilege. No one could be more privileged than another. And the aristocracy, by virtue of being privileged, were a danger to society. They were a danger to society. And they were not part of the Third Estate. So essentially Sieyès kind of banned the aristocracy from France. And so when Austria, Britain, France's neighbours, Prussia, begin to see that France is revolting, France is weak, France is open, we can steal all the land, we can get all the money, we can get all the riches. France has no one to protect them. They've just got rid of the aristocracy. Who are they going to have to protect them? So the revolutionary leaders come up with a big idea. The levée en masse, which is essentially mass conscription. Originally, it was meant to be a kind of voluntary thing. Everyone was meant to be instilled with the revolutionary spirit. And then they realised that rhetoric wouldn't work. And they had to make it mandatory. So the levée en masse says that all Frenchmen, it's important, Frenchmen, they tied it to nationality. So to be a citizen, you had to be French. It got rid of the foreign mercenaries. And it's claimed as the rise of nationalism. All Frenchmen are permanently requisitioned for the armed forces, or for aiding the armed forces. Men were sent to fight, women were sent to help in industry. Old men were meant to stand in the market square and peddle stories about French successes. Children were meant to help make cloth. They were pretty intense, they were pretty industrial. So everybody was included. It was a national effort. And they say that's the rise of nationalism. So nationalism didn't just come because everyone just decided to be patriotic. It was mainly because the French kind of shot themselves in the foot. And they needed people to protect them. Or at least that's how I interpreted it in my readings. My two favourite topics of the year were actually to do with plants, and that sounds really boring. But the first one was how, if you know Carl Linnaeus, he came up with binomial nomenclature, so Homo sapiens, like that Latin name you see in species, that's Carl Linnaeus. It was about how his naming system erased indigenous knowledge because we imposed a kind of Western system of representation onto indigenous people. So it's like how language is a medium of imperialism, and it was applied to plants, like the breadfruit. The breadfruit is a very interesting history because essentially when the American Revolution happened, or before the American Revolution, Britain wanted to quell the spirit of liberty in the colonies, and so they passed a series of acts to restrain colonial self-government and isolate it economically. But the slave owners on the islands of St. Vincent and kind of peninsula, they complained that these economic restrictions made it expensive for them to feed their slaves. And so they asked Joseph Banks, who was one of the directors of Kew Gardens. Let me just check that, I swear he was. Anyways, they asked Joseph Banks, and they go, Joseph Banks, can we get the breadfruit, please? Because it was meant to be a superfood. Both Banks and this guy called John Ellis had falsely betrayed the, oh no, sorry. Joseph Banks was leader of the president of the Royal Society and advised King George on Kew Gardens. It was a hooker. That was... My apologies, guys. I'm a bit rusty. The exams were a month ago. Anyways, they had kind of changed indigenous perspectives on the breadfruit, and they were like, oh, the breadfruit is the best thing ever. It's so nutrient dense, even though the indigenous people were like, it'll kind of make you full. They're like, no, the breadfruit is the best thing ever, it's going to fill everybody up. You can just eat breadfruit like it's a fruit of Eden, you don't have to do any work, the breadfruit should always be there. Obviously, fake news. And they sent out this ship called the Bounty to get the breadfruit and transport it from Tahiti all the way to America. And then the people in the Bounty mutinied. There's a famous film about it that I haven't watched. I don't watch any films really, I'm too lazy. So they had to send out another ship. But I believe it's in Tahitian mythology, the breadfruit comes from a man who sacrifices himself for his family. In Vanuatu, it comes from the breast of a daughter who sacrifices it, and it turns into a breadfruit to feed her mother and sister. And then in Hawaii, it comes from someone's testicles, a dead man's testicles. So while Joseph Banks and all these colonial people are like, wow, the breadfruit's great, the people on Tahiti and Vanuatu and Hawaii are not convinced. Which is probably why, when the breadfruit was finally introduced, the slaves didn't eat it. Because why would they? It's just been imposed onto them. The final thing I could tell you a lot about, this is my best topic this year, was the Great Divergence. So why Europe, or specifically Britain, went so far ahead in the world than China in the early modern period. And it was about energy availability. So before coal, everybody had to use energy generated from the land. The only way that you could make energy was through photosynthesis, because there was no coal. It just so happened that Asia produced 4 times on a hectare of land of what Europe could produce, which meant they could sustain a very large population on much less land, which meant that in their economy, because they had such a high population, it was so easy to intensify agriculture because one field could feed a family, whereas in Europe you needed 15. They had so many people that they relied on labour-intensive modes of production, whereas in Europe they relied on capital-intensive, which is like machinery, animals, which kind of moved them structurally. Like they were more inclined to industrialise, because industrialisation doesn't always mean progress. And it was also because of this argument called goose stakers. Britain was able to expand into the Americas and virtually like steal American production and make it their own. So they could like symbolically extend Britain's industrial potential. And they could break free of the limits of photosynthesis, which only converts 0.4% of energy at its maximum, like usefully. So photosynthesis sucks. And sustainably, if it were to cover the whole of Britain, which is 60 million acres or so in woodland, you could produce 2.5 million tonnes of iron. China in 2008 used 500 million. So you can't do anything sustainably without coal. So it was really coal that was the big player. But, okay, I think I've yapped for enough weird concepts now. It's a very different type of historical kind of facts video. I suppose it's not facts, it's just historical ramble. But I hope you enjoyed it. It hasn't cooled down at all. I'm still not going to be able to sleep. But at least I have a fun video out of it. Thank you very much for watching.